There's something timeless about a cigar glowing in the dark. One ember, one curl of smoke, and for a moment the world slows down. Now imagine that glow in the middle of a Civil War camp. Guns stacked in the mud, boots caked with dust, men staring at the stars with faces drawn and tired. In their hands, not a weapon, but a cigar.
Welcome to the Cigar and Whiskey Podcast, where every episode takes you deeper into the stories, traditions, and flavors that make cigars and spirits unforgettable. So pour a glass, light a stick, and settle in.
The war was fought with cannons and rifles, but it was lived in moments like these. Small rituals that gave soldiers a taste of home and a reason to press on. And tobacco was at the center of it. Picture a Union camp after a long march. The men slump onto damp ground, stiff uniforms crackling as they sit. Coffee steams in tin cups. Somewhere, a fiddle scratches out a tune. Around the fire, a few soldiers pass a single cigar. One man jokes about counting his puffs. Another closes his eyes to savor the draw before handing it on. For them, that smoke is a lifeline to normal life, back to front porches and summer evenings far away. In Confederate camps, tobacco was closer at hand. Virginia and North Carolina fields lay just beyond the lines, and soldiers often carried twists of leaf in their haversacks. But a good cigar was still worth saving. One Confederate private wrote that he held onto his last one for a week before lighting it under a foggy sky, calling it the sweetest hour of the war. Union soldiers had the opposite problem. They had coffee in plenty, but tobacco was scarce. Sutlers sold cigars at outrageous prices. When supplies ran dry, men rolled camp cigars out of scraps of leaf and newspaper, smokes that burned hot and tasted worse, but still felt like treasure. In letters home, soldiers begged their families to tuck cigars into care packages, often valuing them more than food. And sometimes, cigars bridged the divide between enemies. On quiet nights, Union and Confederate pickets would call across rivers. One side would shout, "Coffee," and the other would answer, "Tobacco." Soon men met in the shadows, trading beans for leaf. One Union private wrote of tossing his last cigar across the line, and a Confederate who caught it lifted his cap in thanks before fading back into the dark. For a few minutes, the war softened into something human. But the most famous cigar story didn't come from a trade or a campfire. It came from a field near Frederick, Maryland, in September of 1862. A Union soldier stumbled on 3 cigars wrapped in a piece of paper. At first, it seemed like luck, a rare luxury to share with friends. But the wrapper was no ordinary scrap. It was General Robert E. Lee's Special Order 191, the detailed plan for moving the Confederate Army. When we return, we find out what happened to those plans.
You're listening to the Cigar and Whiskey Podcast, your companion for cigar culture, whiskey wisdom, and everything in between. Want more? Visit us anytime at cigarandwhiskeyguide.com for articles, reviews, and pairing tips.
The cigars and the paper raced up the chain of command to General George B. McClellan, who crowed, "Here is a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." Days later, at Antietam, the Union struck Lee's divided forces. It became the bloodiest single day in American history. But it ended his northern push and gave President Abraham Lincoln the victory he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. 3 cigars, forgotten in a field, had changed the course of the war. Cigars wove their way into other stories too. Ulysses S. Grant wasn't always a famous cigar man, but one newspaper sketch after an early victory showed him with a cigar clenched in his teeth. Admirers began sending them by the box. A staff officer joked that the general could hardly walk for the piles of cigars. Grant obliged the image, and the image stuck. On the Confederate side, Stonewall Jackson was more likely to chew tobacco than light a cigar, but soldiers noticed everything. Habits became legend. For the men in the ranks, cigars were about survival and ritual. After battle, soldiers often lit them as a kind of ceremony. One private in Virginia wrote that the glow of his cigar reminded him of the campfires of heaven. Another soldier described smoking beside the graves of friends, the smoke curling upward like a prayer. It wasn't just indulgence, it was remembrance. And sometimes it was the only way to steady trembling hands. Not every moment was solemn. Camps were full of small comedy too. A recruit inhaled a cigar like a pipe and turned green to the delight of his comrades. Another bragged he could toast bread on his cigar's foot until he set his sleeve smoldering and earned himself a nickname that stuck for weeks. Humor was survival too, and tobacco often lit the spark. Families back home knew the value of a cigar to a soldier. Mothers wrapped a pair into boxes with socks and letters. Sweethearts slipped them into parcels with notes scrawled on the inside of the lid. When those packages arrived, men often passed the cigars around first, the letters second. A soldier once joked that his wife's handwriting smelled better than any Havana leaf. The laughter that followed was worth more than the smoke itself. In winter quarters, cigars helped pass the long, cold nights. Soldiers sat in makeshift huts, smoke filling the rafters, trading advice on the best way to cut and light. It was all small talk. Whose boots leaked? What she wrote in her last letter? Which colonel was most likely to get them killed? But the act of smoking together built a kind of family. In places designed to grind men down, the cigar became a tiny anchor of humanity. And when the war ended, the habit came home. Veterans lit cigars at weddings and harvests, at courthouse steps and family reunions. For some, the ember carried memory. For others, it was the steady rhythm of survival brought back into peace. The ritual lingered, long after the muskets fell silent. So what did cigars mean in the Civil War? They were comfort and currency. They were bridges between enemies. Once, they were even wrapped by a secret document that reshaped the nation. Most of all, they were a way for men to say, without words, "I'm still here." The ember was small, but it carried more than fire. It carried patience, memory, and a stubborn refusal to let the world be only about suffering. That's what those soldiers found in the glow, and it's still there for us now. So the next time you strike a match and draw in that first puff, take a moment. Picture the camps, the quiet trades across enemy lines, the soldier saving one cigar for a victory he might not see. In that ember's glow, you'll find the same ritual that carried men through the storm of war, and still carries us through today.
Thanks for listening to the Cigar and Whiskey podcast. Subscribe and share with a fellow aficionado, and keep the journey going at cigarandwhiskeyguide.com, where every puff and pour has a story.